of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
America's words carry weight and meaning, as they have since independence. The actions of this great nation matter even more. President Lincoln understood this so well with his reflection in the magisterial Gettysburg Address, that the world may little note what we say, but will never forget what we do.
Tonight, the King's speech. King Charles addresses Congress, only the second British monarch in history to do so, with a message of unity. The visit rolling on tonight with a state dinner at the White House as the U.S. and U.K. navigate a tense geopolitical backdrop. Bloomberg's Jeff Mason joins us live ahead from the North Lawn. Later, Congressman Sean Casten of Illinois weighs in from the Hill.
And crude awakening. Brent closes above $111 a barrel as concerns grow over the prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump says Iran is pushing for relief from a U.S. naval blockade as negotiations continue, while the UAE announces it will exit OPEC. What it all means for markets and geopolitics, coming up.
Plus, breaking news tonight. Comey indicted. A grand jury indicting former FBI Director James Comey over alleged threats against the president on social media. It marks the second indictment he's faced since President Trump's return to the White House. What we know tonight and what comes next.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. And we begin our coverage this evening just a short time after King Charles delivered a joint address to Congress. The King of England making his way through the halls of the Capitol into the well of the House following a morning at the White House where he sat down with President Trump, who praised the special relationship between the U.S. and U.K.
If John Adams and George Washington or the King's fifth great-grandfather could see that sight, they might be absolutely shocked, but probably only for a moment. Surely they would be delighted that the wounds of war healed into the most cherished friendship. Think of that very, very long ago difficult war, and yet those wounds did indeed heal into the most cherished of friendships, most cherished.
For more, we turn now to Bloomberg's Jeff Mason, who's joining us live from the White House North Lawn. So, Jeff, clearly the president spoke of friendship. The king did as well in his address to Congress. But for all of the talk about the monarchy being somewhat separated from politics, talk us through some of the not so thinly veiled remarks the king made.
The king had some words for President Trump, even if that was not how it was designed or not how it was presented, because it was a speech to Congress. But I think you're right to note that President Trump was very gracious in his remarks at the South Lawn of the White House earlier. I was out there for that. He's clearly thrilled that the King of England is here visiting him and doing the state visit. But the king also used this opportunity of that speech in Congress to really have an undercurrent of, if not criticism, at least a push for President Trump to change some of his ways and to change some of his language even addressed to the United Kingdom. A couple things just going through the speech. Number one, he talked about NATO and the importance of that gem of a relationship. He also talked about words mattering. President Trump, of course, uses a lot of words, both in public when he's speaking, but also on social media that are often critical of the UK and of Prime Minister Starmer. And he also talked about Ukraine. Ukraine being certainly something that King Charles showed passion for, and that is now a controversial topic in the halls of Congress and in this White House, much different from how the previous administration approached the Ukraine-Russia war. So those are just a few examples from that speech that I think could absolutely be listened to or read as veiled criticism of President Trump.
Some subtle points made today, maybe some not so subtle, Jeff, including his reference to 9/11 when NATO, he said, invoked Article 5 for the first time, something that jumped out to us. But they're not done yet. There's an important state dinner that has yet to take place in the White House behind you. That toast that the president will make with the king will be seen by a lot of people. It'll be diced up on social media, played on morning shows tomorrow. I'm sure People magazine will have a spread on the royal visit. This is a way for Donald Trump to appeal to people beyond political shows, getting to living rooms. Is this an opportunity for him tonight?
For sure it is, just like it was an opportunity this morning, and he used that opportunity in his first set of remarks to be very gracious about the relationship with Britain. And he spoke personally about his mother having been born in Scotland. Again, he absolutely kicked this off in a gracious way. I think what will be interesting to see is whether he takes any of the King's words to heart about everything from climate to Ukraine to NATO. Again, as you said, Joe, that was certainly a point that the King wanted to make in those public remarks. You have to wonder, and I wish I could be a fly on the wall for this tonight, whether he brings them up individually when he's sitting with the president at the state dinner.
Well, if anyone will find out, it's you. Bloomberg's Jeff Mason with us live from the White House North Lawn. Jeff, we thank you. Still dying to hear about the menu tonight. Joining us with more on today's royal visit, Sir Peter Westmacott, who is the UK's ambassador to the U.S. during the Obama administration, among other ambassadorships. Sir Peter, welcome. It's great to have you as part of our program this evening on Bloomberg TV and radio. I know it's rather late where you are, and we appreciate you staying up for us. Is the King's job on this trip to speak directly to the American people, to close the gap politically between America and the UK, or to right the ship internally within the United Kingdom?
I think his job is to show that the 250th anniversary of American independence is something that really matters to the British people and the British nation. It's not about the politics. It's not about intergovernmental relationship. It's about showing that these two countries, I think President Trump talked about these two, the world's most exceptional nations that the world has ever known. I mean, pretty strong language. And I think the King's job was to lay all that out, the importance of the relationship between the peoples and the nations. I don't think it's about setting right a ship back at home. You know, there are political issues going on back in the United Kingdom. We all know about that's not his job. His job was to come here and to celebrate the relationship between the nations and the peoples. And I think, as Paul Mason was just saying, make one or two points of principle, which he holds dear, in his own remarks to the joint houses of Congress.
Well, and as you talk about his remarks being focused on two nations, yes, but he also repeatedly made reference to NATO. He talked about the need for unyielding resolve in Ukraine. And I wonder, Sir Peter, what you made of those particular comments, what message the King was trying to send.
Well, I think his remarks on NATO and Article 5 were a gentle reminder that when, for example, President Trump says NATO's never been there for us, it's simply not true. NATO was there for America under the only time Article 5 was invoked. And NATO countries, particularly the United Kingdom, have been there for America on other occasions, particularly in Iraq, but also in Afghanistan and other places. So I think there was a point there that NATO is not just a bunch of freeloading Europeans. And in his own inimitable way, the King was making that point. He also, remember, he sees President Zelensky almost every time he comes to the United Kingdom. He feels very strongly about the principle of Putin's invasion of Ukraine being wrong and being bad for European security, and is very aware, as we all are, that if you're going to get Putin out of Ukraine, the United States is an absolutely key player. So I suspect that was personal too, that he wanted to set out what he thought about that. And then you can make what you will of his remarks about checks and balances and about the importance of action as well as words. I think these were issues which he holds dear, and I imagine that in private conversation, a number of those issues will be continued without records being taken and without the media being present to listen to exactly what is said.
Mm-hmm. Interesting reference to isolationism at one point during the speech. Let's listen to the King for just a moment.
I pray with all my heart that our alliance will continue to defend our shared values with our partners in Europe and the Commonwealth and across the world. And that we ignore the clarion calls to become ever more inward-looking.
Ever more inward-looking. Sir Peter, will this go down as the most political speech of its kind?
Well, I can't think of all the others that have been made, but I think there is definitely political substance there. He is warning against those people who believe in isolationism. That may be a thinly veiled message to some of the populist messages of some of the political parties in the United Kingdom, which are doing better than they were. But it was also a pretty clear message that he believes that the future is not just about keeping the relationship with the United States in strong shape and in excellent condition and with the right political relationship, but it's also about Europe. The United Kingdom, of course, left the European Union at the time of Brexit in 2016. Well, that was when a referendum was taking place. But here he is saying that the future lies in closer relations, not only with America, but also with Europe and the Commonwealth. So I think that is a very clear message about multilateralism, which I'm sure His Majesty will have thought about very carefully.
Well, and clearly the rift in the U.S. relationship with Europe more widely is something we've focused on continually since the president came back into office. But it does seem the rift in particular, the political rift with the U.K. and with Prime Minister Keir Starmer, has widened since the war with Iran began. And I wonder if you think the king has done any favors for the prime minister with this visit.
I think the president seems to draw a clear distinction between his relationship with the king, his fellow head of state, and with the United Kingdom on the one hand, and then on the other with the British government and to some extent the British Prime Minister. That was a warm relationship at the beginning. It seems to be a bit more frayed now. To the extent that the king coming to the United States, clearly giving enormous pleasure, as your correspondents have said, to the president, and saying these things about the importance of America, about the importance of shared values, about the importance of what we can do together. I think that does help the Prime Minister and the British government to give, more affection, more mutual respect, more sort of specialness, if you like, to the relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States of America. So in a way, it does help, but let us not fool ourselves into thinking that simply because there's a successful state visit with very good mood music and very refined words, that this necessarily means that the president is going to be any more benevolent and any less ready to be rude about the British government, because in his mind, they're different issues.
So just lastly, Sir Peter, what do you make of the president's apparent obsession with royalty? He talked about why he is so interested in the culture surrounding the throne. He talked about his mother watching the coronation on television when he was a child. He talked about the fact that his mother thought that King Charles, I guess then Prince Charles, was attractive and in fact had a crush on him. Is President Trump obsessed with the man or the crown?
President Trump has always, seems to me, had a soft spot for the British monarchy. He loved the time that he spent with the Queen. He was extremely complimentary about her. He loved having both of his state visits, unprecedented, as he likes to remind us, to have 2 state visits in such quick succession.
Indeed.
I think he says, that the king is a close friend of his. I think it's a combination of both relishing the relationship with the monarchy, something very special to him and to his mother, as he likes to remind us, and his Scottish roots, but also there's something personal there that he does clearly enjoy the king's company. So I think it's both. Is it an obsession with monarchy? I can't say, but it is something that he clearly feels very, very strongly about that. And he has made clear in public that regardless of what's going on between the United States government and the British government, that his attachment to Britain and to the British royal family remains absolutely undiminished.
All right, Sir Peter Westmacott, former UK ambassador to the U.S., thank you so much for joining us. Meanwhile, on Wall Street, earnings season is in full swing, and we saw a sell-off in tech giants today as tech giants dragged down stocks amid concerns resurfacing over whether vast investments in artificial intelligence are going to pay off. This is ahead of course, a bunch of mega cap tech results tomorrow. And joining us with more from World Headquarters in New York is Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who is live from there. So, Romaine, how much of today's action really was all about fears around OpenAI?
100%. Kaylee. In fact, I was tongue-tied by it, too. You had that Wall Street Journal story earlier this morning, which made the claim that apparently the sales growth and sales metrics that OpenAI had set for itself weren't necessarily being met. Now, we should point out OpenAI later came out with a public statement pushing back against that. But remember, when you have these sky-high valuations, any sort of sense that there's any sort of flaw in that AI narrative, and you're going to get a sell-off. When you look at the NASDAQ 100, it had its biggest gap lower at the open in about 4 weeks. And the idea here here, and I want to put a fine point on this. You have about 5 companies, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Meta, and Oracle, that have basically said they're going to spend $680 billion on the AI build-out this year alone. But here's the bugaboo. That's not money that's actually spent. That's basically saying we will do this. So any sense that they might not either spend that money or even be able to spend that money means you have to re-rate some of these stocks, and that's what you saw today. And, of course, it kind of comes at a really auspicious time because of those names I just told you, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Meta. Well, guess what? They all report earnings in less than 24 hours, and you can bet the number one thing everyone's going to look at is what their CapEx spend is and whether they're going to stand by those numbers for the rest of the year.
Well, Romain, we were just talking about you and Katie. Tomorrow evening is going to, it's like Kaylee and I getting ready for an election night. The after the bell session is going to be wild, and it falls on a Fed day. What are you doing to prepare? What should our audience do?
This might come as a shock to you, Joe. We're actually going to be kind of ignoring the Fed because we kind of have to. I mean, look, we're going to pay attention, of course, to the Federal Reserve decision, which will be no decision, but there will be a lot of debate, of course, about the war in Iran, whether the inflationary pressures are something that the Fed will have to tackle somewhere down the line here. But, of course, this is going to be a little sentimental, Joe. Everyone is really kind of looking at Jay Powell, what is supposed to be his final press conference as Fed chair. Is he going to get up there and be the serious Jay Powell? Will he be a little bit more relaxed? Will he kind of reminisce on his time? Will he come out in a Deadhead T-shirt or something? No one knows, but we're all going to keep an eye on that. In all seriousness, no, this is kind of one of these weird days where earnings will probably take a little bit more precedent than interest rates and the Fed, but certainly all eyes will still be on both.
I think he just brings the guitar. He can sing with Michael McKee. It's going to be a great day. Bloomberg's Romain Bostic. Eat your Wheaties tomorrow morning. We'll all be watching. Coming up, the UAE is leaving OPEC. How about that? Dealing a blow to the group and its leader, Saudi Arabia. We'll discuss the global impact amid the U.S.-Iran conflict. Coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We're doing everything we can to increase refinery throughput. American oil production is at record high. American oil exports to our allies abroad are at record high. So look, we're going through a period of discomfort to solve a 47-year crisis. And gasoline prices are still $1 a gallon cheaper than they were during the middle of the Biden administration.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew, listening there to Energy Secretary Chris Wright, who spoke with us this morning on Bloomberg. Those comments coming the same day gas prices hit their highest since the war with Iran began, still hovering well above $4 a gallon, almost $4.18 today, according to AAA. Meantime, the UAE, with a big announcement today, planning to leave OPEC. After 6 decades of membership, the UAE's exit is a significant loss for the group, which has spent years balancing global oil markets and defending prices by managing crude supplies. Joining us now for more, Michelle Brouhard, head of Policy and Geopolitical Risk at Kpler. Michelle, it's great to have you back this evening on Bloomberg. Is this the beginning of the end of OPEC?
You know, we've tried to call the death of OPEC for 6 decades, and it just hasn't come to fruition. Yeah. This could be, OPEC is mainly Russia and Saudi for the most part. The UAE has always had, for the last few years, always had 1 foot in and 1 foot out. So it's not a surprise that they're leaving. And they almost left in 2022. So this is kind of just the same rift that had been going on for a while. I don't think it's the end of OPEC, but it certainly is a new chapter in the life of OPEC.
Well, we actually on Bloomberg spoke to the UAE's energy minister earlier today about the justification for leaving. Now, it was a bit of a lengthy explanation, but I think it's worth listening to. Here he is.
The decision is taken at the right time in our view, because it's not going to hugely impact the market. The market is under supplied, and because of the unfortunate closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the level of inventories that we have, unfortunately seeing the world go through this unprecedented time where the level of inventories are going down significantly, would require an extraordinary measures that with the agility of UAE decision making, we believe leaving the group now will enable us to attain to the market requirements at a pace that is appropriate from our point of view, and we don't want to be constrained by any other groups in taking that decision.
So the idea here being you don't want to have to, if you're the UAE, consult with the entire cartel to make adjustments to your production levels and quotas at a time when the market is probably going to be incredibly volatile and take a lot of readjustment in the aftermath, whenever we get to an aftermath of the situation in the Middle East and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, knowing it's not just about the free flow of transit in the waterway, but in many instances restarting production that has been shut in. This did not help oil prices today, unless you're a bull. We saw a West Texas Intermediate top $100 a barrel. It closed just below triple digits, Kaylee, up almost 4%. Brent was already well on its way above $100 at 111 at the close, up about 3%, which gives us a sense of kind of the chaos here surrounding this whole thing. And as the president of the United States welcomes everyone to come to America to buy oil, we could have a couple of different factions at play here. Absolutely. And of course, we talk about the economic pain driven here at home by these higher oil prices and higher prices at the pump. The president argues that the greater economic pain is the one currently being inflicted on Iran via the naval blockade. In fact, so much so that he took to Truth Social today to say Iran has just informed us that they are in, and this is a quote, a state of collapse. And as we welcome Michelle Brouhard back to the conversation, I wonder, Michelle, as you consider Iran's economic situation right now, if you think that there is some fact in the president's statement, is Iran on verge of collapse?
You know, they've been on the verge of collapse for about 5 or 6 years now. So we've seen a lot of pressure on Iran through the sanction that were put into place after Trump arrived in office in 2018. That sanction pressure has put pressure on Iran since then. The naval blockade, of course, puts more pressure on Iran, but all of the oil that they sold at the beginning of the war, they still have that war chest that they can live off of. I think the real pressure that Iran has is that their tanks are filling up and they're going to have to start shutting in some production. That's probably the first step.
Wanted to ask you about that. They've started loading tankers again. There are about 6 to 8 super tankers just idling in waters near our blockade just beyond the strait. How long before Iran does have to start shutting oil wells? Is it weeks?
No, I think we probably have about 5 or 6 days before they have to start shutting in oil wells. Or they need to get more ships in so that they can load more crude onto the ships to have more floating storage.
Wow.
Well, that's incredible to consider. Do you think we could see a deal for that reason in the next 5 or 6 days, Michelle?
I don't. The only reason I think that is because Iran has been under pressure for 47 years. So they can withstand a lot of pressure over what can happen to the United States. The stalemate could last for weeks until somebody has enough pressure. It's either going to be the global market tells Trump that we can't take this shortage of oil any longer, or it's going to be Iran who says we want to be able to get our oil out of the market, or we want to be able to turn our pumps back on. So I don't see that happening anytime soon.
All right, Michelle Brouhard, head of policy and geopolitical risk at Kpler, thank you so much for joining us. And still ahead, Democratic Congressman Sean Casten of Illinois will join us right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Those roots go even further back in history. The U.S. Supreme Court Historical Society has calculated that Magna Carta is cited in at least 160 Supreme Court cases since 1789, not least as the foundation of the principle that executive power is subject to checks and balances.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. And that was King Charles this afternoon delivering remarks to Congress, discussing not just the importance of the balance between executive power and other branches of government, but also a number of other subjects. We saw lawmakers there staying on their feet for a good 15 to 20 seconds after those particular executive power comments. And joining us now with his reaction, live from Capitol Hill, is someone who was in the chamber for those remarks, Democratic Congressman Sean Casten of Illinois. He serves on the House Financial Services and Joint Economic Committees and was in the room in the chamber for the King's speech today. Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg. When we consider not just the King's words around executive power, but his calls to reject isolationism, the importance of the transatlantic relationship, I wonder what kind of message you think he was trying in perhaps subtle terms to convey not just to your colleagues, but to the White House.
So overall, it was just a really good speech, and it's a nice reminder that when you are a person of great power, you don't have to be really explicit in your digs. You know, you can be a little subtle, and I think all of us in the room understood when he was talking about the importance of the transatlantic relationship and the importance of us standing with European allies and supporting Ukraine, and the importance of checks and balances and the importance of rule of law. That's non-controversial, except for the current situation with the current president of the United States. But he didn't need to be explicit, right? Because in that room, of course, we all agree with those principles. Judge us by our actions, not by our words. But it was, I think, just a master class in diplomacy conducted the right way.
Interesting. You know, he had a lot to say, a lot of it very nuanced as he referred to NATO. He talked about 9/11, invoking Article 5 on behalf of the United States. He talked about the risks of becoming an inward-looking nation. And it seemed to be a love fest no matter what he said, Congressman. There was one exception. When this lifelong climate activist said our generation must decide how to address the collapse of critical natural systems. You were in the room. Looked like Republicans did not stand for that one moment. What did you think of that?
Yeah, and it was disappointing. I mean, nowhere but the United States is that considered a controversial view. I would point out that prior to talking about the collapse of natural systems, he was praising our natural parks and Teddy Roosevelt's idea that we should create these things to remind us of the greatness and beauty of America. Sitting front row right in front of him was Doug Burgum, Secretary of the Interior. And to say that, to praise, those national treasures, and then simply to state, I think, the obvious point that our economic systems, our diplomatic systems, our political systems are all built on top of natural systems. And if those natural systems are fraying, as they are right now, we should be concerned. That shouldn't be controversial. I believe that was the only point in the speech where there wasn't both sides of the aisle standing up. And again, just for the Secretary of the Interior to do that, I'd go back to what I said before. Diplomacy is subtle, and you don't need to overstress your point. It was a choice of the Secretary of the Interior not to stand in that. That's a diplomatic choice. I don't think it's a wise one, but it was a choice.
Well, we know, Congressman, that you've spent much of your time in Congress focusing on issues around climate and around renewable energy specifically. And I wonder, given the market dynamics we are experiencing now with the war in Iran and with oil and natural gas that is obviously not easily getting out of the Middle East right now, and higher gasoline prices have resulted from that, if you expect that there may be a drive back into renewable energy when obviously this administration has in large part turned from that in this term.
Well, I mean, let's just talk about energy markets generally. Regardless of what type of energy project that you're investing in, it is much easier to invest in energy markets when energy prices are high. That's not because that's in consumers' interest, obviously, but there's a lot of things that all of a sudden start to pencil when energy prices are high. And so the foreign policy of the Trump White House is enhancing the investment thesis for all energy technologies, especially those that don't have any marginal operating costs, as all renewable projects do. I think as against that, you've got a real challenge that the domestic policy of the United States has greatly confused investors who are saying, if I'm going to go and deploy the capital to identify a site location, to do the engineering, to get the permitting, to line up the financing, and you have a White House that is as fickle as this one is, saying, you know, you've got a loan guarantee for a transmission line, and now I'm going to stop that because of some personal vendetta against the wind you're going to connect to markets. You've got a permit to build an offshore wind farm, and I'm going to slow that down. You know, these projects in New England have now come back online. But I think there's been a general sort of, I don't want to say a total seizing up, but a slowing down in the investment community of saying, do I trust that this White House will honor the rule of law, or do I have to give the president a plane as Qatar did in order to get their attention? That's a horrible thing to have to think, but I think that dynamic, the foreign policy of the United States is enhancing the investment thesis for clean energy. The domestic policy of the United States is making it harder.
To your point, Congressman, apologies for interrupting, we heard from the Energy Secretary Chris Wright, who made clear it's Bafo time to invest in energy. Here's what he told us from Croatia this morning on Bloomberg.
Here I am in Dubrovnik in Croatia, signing multi-billion-dollar deals to sell American energy exports. That is the fastest growing export out of our country. We're selling American natural gas, American oil, American jet fuel, diesel, and gasoline all around the world. We're not going to stop those exports. We're going to grow those exports.
So, Congressman, just to get back to the essence of Kaylee's question, take a look at solar stocks, the knock that the industry has taken since the beginning of the Trump administration. Is this industry on the rocks, or is it investable and has a future?
No, look at what investors want to build in the United States. There are no investors lining up to build coal plants in the United States. And I think Chris Wright's, but there are investors lining up to build solar and wind. That's what markets want because it's cheaper. I think Secretary Wright's comments are a tell. That sounds like the energy policy of Angola, right? If you're praising that we can dig holes in the United States and export things to other countries that they can turn into higher value goods and services, that's a very extractive view of the United States economy. And I would submit to you that 9 out of 10 Americans do not give a damn about whether or not we are digging things out of the United States and selling it in Dubrovnik. What they want to know is, what are you doing to give me access to cheaper energy so that I can keep my home warm, so that I can keep my house well lit, so that the factory that employs me is going to have low costs and can compete against foreign competition. And if you think the only purpose of U.S. energy policy is to dig holes and export, I guess appoint Chris Wright Energy Secretary. But that's not historically what's really built the strength. We have to have a consumer-focused energy policy, not an exporter-focused energy policy.
And finally, Congressman, I'd like to ask you about what may or may not happen in the House at some point this evening, or at the very least before Thursday, which, of course, is the new deadline to pass an extension of FISA Section 702. It seems that this right now can't even get out of the Rules Committee. If this were to have to come to the House floor under suspension of the rules, would you cast a vote supporting extension? Do you think other Democrats would?
So I've lost track of how many times I've voted to extend FISA, but I've always voted to extend FISA. It's come up roughly once a year since I first got elected in 2018. A lot of the challenge of the last package that came through, I think you had a lot of Democratic support in theory, but they'd done a 5-year reauthorization, and there's a real concern, particularly, with given some of the issues with Kash Patel, Tulsi Gabbard, of can these people be trusted for 5 years? I think if they were to bring that back and do a clean FISA reauthorization, with a 1-year horizon, that's probably doable. There's always going to be some concerns between the Judiciary Committee and the Intelligence Committee around, on the one hand, how do we make sure that we protect American civil liberties who might be inadvertently swept up in a FISA search? On the other hand, how do we protect American citizens when we're sweeping up, bad actors and things they might want to do in the United States? Which means that there's always going to be a block of civil liberty-focused people who are going to lose, and whether that's, Freedom Caucus libertarians or folks to the political left. There's a path on a suspension, but to do that, you really need a package that Republican leadership is working with Democratic leadership, and so far that hasn't happened. They're just trying to deal with their own far-right flank, and so far that hasn't managed to get it out of the Rules Committee. I'd like to get to bed at a reasonable hour tonight. Last I heard, maybe we're on the floor at 2 a.m. tonight if they can get something through. This is no way to run a circus.
Time to break out the cots, it sounds like, once again. Democratic Congressman Sean Casten of Illinois. It's good to see you, sir. Thank you for being with us here.
Always a pleasure.
On Bloomberg. As King Charles prepared for his speech to Congress today, Bloomberg sat down with one of the King's subjects, London Mayor Sadiq Khan, at a Bloomberg City Lab event in Madrid. He talked about next week's local elections, praised New York Mayor Mamdani, and expanded on the state of the Labour Party in the UK. Listen.
Look, when you speak, as I do, on a daily basis to chief executives, to people who want to invest anywhere they can, to angel investors, one of the things they're crying out for when it comes to where to invest is certainty, is stability, is calm. We have that in the UK with Prime Minister Keir Starmer. We have a 5-year parliament. We're approaching the middle of that parliament, and you have hiccups. And the rhythm of government is, you're not going to say popular the entire 5 years. I remember during President Obama's midterm, in his first term, the shellacking he received in the midterms. And so it's similar to that when those watching from America. I'm confident, though, that Keir's got the right values, the right policies, the right team to take us through this temporary bad weather he's facing, to lead us in the next half of this parliament, and we'll start seeing some of the fruit of the seeds he's planted in the first 2 years.
There will be a test of everyone, including the Labour Party, in the local elections next week. How do you think some of these things that are happening within the party are going to play out in the elections?
So our May the 7th elections are almost like a midterm elections, and historically, when there's been a Labour government, in the midterms, the council elections, Labour does less well. I'm hoping that doesn't happen this time because we've got some great Labour councils delivering housing, delivering youth services, supporting communities, investing in their parks, investing in their libraries. So we'll have to wait and see, but it's going to be a tough election for Labour. I think that's priced in, and that's one of the things I'm hoping my colleagues in Parliament have cool, calm heads and realise we've got 5 years to deliver in terms of the national government. The peroration, the peak, is towards the end of that 5 years, and we don't want panic if we do badly on May the 7th, and I'm hoping the polls aren't as accurate as they've been in the past.
You can find the full conversation with London Mayor Sadiq Khan at the Bloomberg City Lab event in Madrid, online or on the terminal. Coming up, the State Department is close to finalizing a redesign of the U.S. passport that's set to feature a picture of President Trump. We'll have more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. In tonight's Power Brief, the U.S. State Department is preparing to roll out a limited edition passport commemorating the 250th anniversary of American independence, which will prominently feature an image of President Donald Trump. In a mock-up of the proposed passport obtained by Fox News and the Bulwark, an image of Trump is seen surrounded by text of the Declaration of Independence and the American flag, with the president's signature printed in gold lettering. The Bulwark reports that 25,000 of these special edition passports will be made. For now, however, the design is still awaiting approval.
Is that real?
That's real.
Well, the FCC will start an early review of TV station licenses owned by Walt Disney-owned ABC. The agency citing, quote, unlawful discrimination, directing ABC stations to file license renewals 2 years earlier than required. This move coming amid renewed tensions, you might say, between the Trump administration and ABC, following a joke from late-night host Jimmy Kimmel last week about Melania Trump becoming a widow. The joke airing just days before the attempted assassination of the president at the Correspondents' Dinner Saturday night, prompting the president, First Lady, to call for Kimmel to be fired. FCC Commissioner Ana Gomez, the sole Democrat on the panel, calls the early review of ABC's licenses a political stunt that, quote, won't stick. A Disney spokesperson responding to the FCC today in a statement saying, quote, ABC and its stations have a long record of operating in full compliance with all FCC rules. We are confident that record demonstrates our continued qualifications as licensees and are prepared to show that through the appropriate legal challenges. Disney closed today down nearly 0.9%.
And for the second time in a year, former FBI Director James Comey has been indicted by the Justice Department. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche announced today that a grand jury in North Carolina indicted Comey on 2 felony counts, alleging he threatened the president's life in a social media post. The case centers around a post from last May where a photo showed the numbers 86 and 47 that were formed by seashells. Critics allege that the number 86 was a reference to violence. Comey deleted the post and denied that that was his intent. Recall last September, the Justice Department brought charges against Comey alleging that he lied to Congress about leaks to the press. Those charges were ultimately dismissed by a federal judge who ruled that the U.S. attorney had brought the case and that attorney had been improperly appointed.
Let's play it to the panel. With us now, Bloomberg politics contributor and Democratic strategist Adam Hodge, alongside Republican strategist Sarah Chamberlain, the president CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership. Adam with Bully Pulpit International. I'll start with you as our Democrat. Here we go again with James Comey. Are we being a little bit too literal with the seashell art, or is this deserved? 86, the president, means what?
I mean, I can't believe we're talking about seashell art as a real criticism of the president. I mean, come on, what are we doing here? But I think the president and his White House and the AG should be tired of losing. I mean, they've gotten so many L's about cases over the course of this administration. They're taking another one here that I don't see any way that this goes any differently. And this is another indication of the president and the White House weaponizing the DOJ to pursue their political enemies. It's why Pam Boendi's out of a job right now. It's why you've had a number of attorney generals and prosecutors resign. They're running this DOJ like a taco stand, and it doesn't seem like they're able to really get convictions that they need.
Does going after Comey appeal to at least some of the base still, or is this really just personal to the president?
I think it's personal to the president at this point, but the former FBI director does love this. He loves the attention. I mean, come on, who does that with seashells? I mean, he started this when he was still the FBI director with the Hillary Clinton mess. I mean, he loves the press, and this is just another way for him to keep in the press.
And the indictment's part of that, you think?
I absolutely do.
Does he write
he
a
sells
book?
books
How does he
on
get?
it.
Yeah, okay.
He makes money off of it.
They're going to arrest him.
I don't have any respect for anything that he has done either.
Wow.
Frankly.
Okay, so this is a win with the House Republican
Absolutely,
conference.
at least with the MAGA. I mean, I think the whole thing's ridiculous. He needs to just go away and be done. Wow. But he taunts Trump all the time.
And look, I still have the scars from 2016 when I was at the DNC to prove it, right? Like, I'm no fan of Jim Comey either. But I think this seems like a very clear weaponization of the Justice Department. I just think it's foolish.
Well, in addition to that, we had other news here in Washington today, including that the king is in town. He's going to have a state dinner at the White House a short time from now after addressing a joint session of Congress. And you were in the room for that as well, Sarah. How was it received when it seemed in some ways much more pointedly political than you would expect from a British monarch?
So I was sitting up in the gallery with a lot of the wives of the Republican members, and it was really interesting because it's like, wow, he's being very political, which the king usually is not. Right. But it was very well received. A lot of standing ovations. Republicans were off their feet, on their feet a great deal. So it was fascinating to hear. He did remind the country and the members of Congress specifically that 9/11, they were there. They've always been our best friends. Yeah. And that was well received. The Republicans stood up and applauded along with the Democrats.
Well, it's an important point. And interesting that you draw on that part of what was a 20 to 30 minute long speech, because the president says that our NATO allies would never be there for us if needed. But that, in fact, was the only time that an Article 5 was invoked.
That's right. And I think King Charles was understated sort of British criticism. And surprisingly went farther than I thought he would go as the monarch from that podium. Yeah. But it's the right thing to do, to call out what you see as real problems at the British government. And I'm sure Keir Starmer, while he won't directly probably applaud it, probably liked some of the things from the king having his back on these important issues.
I actually think he helped him write it, because we all know President Trump loves the royal family. Yeah. So who best to deliver that type of message in front of a joint session than the king?
I thought the most powerful point, though, was the defense of NATO and Ukraine in particular. And you've got a bunch of Republicans who I'm sure have voted against funding for Ukraine, but maybe in their heart of hearts know it's the right thing to do, actually stood up and applauded the king on that point. And I think it speaks to this underlying, probably deeper well of support for Ukraine and the United Kingdom and the U.S. as critical players in that defense. And I hope that continues.
So when the king said that, I was watching what Republicans may not stand up. They all stood up. Even some of the more extreme ones. So I was like, wow, that was surprising.
This is fascinating. We've got our Democrat and our Republican both lit up by this speech today for effectively the same reasons. This was a success.
It was a great success by the king.
Yeah.
And it was nice to see the Queen with him as well. So.
I'd like to get your opinion, Sarah, as to whether or not another effort is going to be a success, and that's the one that the Florida State House, now in special legislative session, is going to be taking up today. DeSantis' new map that could net 4 additional seats for Republicans in the midterms. We actually saw an announcement today from a current Republican, Congressman Daniel Webster, who was against redistricting, that he's no longer even going to seek re-election. He thought this redistricting was a mistake. He called it a slippery slope. What is your feeling about what DeSantis is trying to pull off here?
So after the Virginia, which we may or may not lose finally in court, that's still yet to be decided, DeSantis didn't have a choice. He had to go in and do this. I mean, this got started in Texas.
Did he have to go for 4, though?
He's trying to go for 4 because that puts him back in the lead. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting game we're playing here. But what concerns us with this economy and everything going on, are we softening up some of the solid Republican seats? Right. So we may have a problem and may have to spend more money defending some of them. That is a concern. We're seeing that in Texas as well. So we're a little nervous about it, but it's something that started. California, Virginia, Utah. Here we go.
You've already seen the Democrats call out 8 Republicans that in Florida that we think are at increased risk, and I think this DeSantis dummy Mander has a real risk of backfiring. Just like Texas, I think that a lot of assumptions were made by the Republicans, by the Trump White House, that 2024 was the low water mark and that they were only going to increase their margins from here. I think we're looking at, with gas over $4 a gallon, with food prices going up, and the worst of it may still be ahead of us. There's a real risk for the Republicans that they dramatically undershoot themselves in their ability to get these seats flipped. And Democrats end up with an even bigger majority because we're able to exceed our votes. I mean, we've already won key seats in Mar-a-Lago, in Miami, and in Tampa in the specials. That seems like it very well may continue.
That'd be a rather ironic ending to this whole game, as you call it. Does the game end in Florida? Or there are no more states are
There's
going
no
to try
more
this.
States are looking
so
at
it could be potentially advantage Republican, but we're not going to know until it's too late.
We're not going to know, and we don't know where the Hispanic vote is going to be, as we articulated, in Texas and in Florida.
There is going to be a big legal challenge, though, to this in Florida, and there is an important distinction here between Virginia and Florida. Florida, in their Constitution that passed in 2010, was very clear that partisan redistricting is not allowed, right? And this is not going to the voters to approve it. Right. Yeah. Virginia went to the voters and they voted for it. That's a big difference.
Yeah. Of course, DeSantis said this is about right-sizing and undercounting in the census, population growth, et cetera. We'll see if that argument holds up. Adam Hodge, Sarah Chamberlain, thank you both so much for joining us. And, of course, for more coverage, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Great panel this evening. Thank you both. And thank you for joining us on Balance of Power. Historic day in Washington. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. We'll do it again tomorrow here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.